Hi there, I'm Mark Wood. I'm the lead program manager for Cluster Service, and the next session is on the Whistler enhancements in Cluster Service. With me is Bogdan Raciborski, another one of the Cluster Service program managers. I'll start off, and Bogdan will come in a few minutes to talk about some of the new features for cluster developers planned for Whistler. So, first of all, I want to do a real short bit on how the feature that we're talking about here fits into the overall picture for Windows clustering features, so that you can kind of put it in context. If you don't hear your favorite enhancement, it may be because it's in another portion of our cluster plans. Then I'll go into the Whistler plans for Cluster Service, the portion of the operating system that we're responsible for. I'll finish up with a real short bit on what happens post-Whistler, mostly to give you an idea of the directions that we think are important to you, our customers. And I'd love to get feedback on that also, of course. And I'll finally end up just by throwing up quickly some slides that have URLs and links. I'm not going to talk through those, but you can always use the pause button on your Windows Media to look at that later. So, terminology. There are three terms that it's really important that we use consistently. These aren't necessarily industry standards, but they're ones that we found it very useful to talk about when discussing cluster technology with you, our customers. And so the first one is clone. A clone is an interchangeable server. Network load balancing is the most obvious example. This is a case where I've got multiple servers, each of which has the same data, same applications. When a connection comes in, you don't care which one the connection goes to because they're all clones. And so it takes one type of clustering technology for clones. The opposite of a clone is a partition. A partition is a unique chunk of data or logic, the SQL database that's too large or changing too rapidly to replicate. And so for partitions, because they are single unique resources, you've got to have some way to make sure they are highly available, and that's done through packs. This is the third term that we're going to be using. And a pack is simply a group of servers that has the property that they can move ownership of partitions under software control between servers in the pack. So clones, partitions, packs. The technology that Bogdan and I will be talking about is our pack technology. That is the clustering technology that provides high availability for unique data, unique resources, unique applications. This complements Microsoft's clone clustering technology called network load balancing, or you may have known it in a former life as Windows Load Balancing Service, or before that even perhaps as Convoy. This is available for download for NT4 Enterprise Edition, and it's actually in the box with Windows 2000 Advanced Server, as are both of these. So these are our in-the-box technologies for clustering together front-end clones, where you're balancing the network connection, and also back-end packs for those unique resources, unique partitions. There will be a new clustering technology introduced around mid-year, so between now and Whistler, which is, of course, the focus of this talk, and that's going to be in the new App Center product. And App Center introduces another clone clustering technology called component load balancing that balances the CPU loads. So notice how this complements NLB. NLB balances workload that will most naturally bottleneck first on the network. CLB balances workload that will most naturally bottleneck first on the CPU, so very complementary. And App Center also has tools to help you manage these clusters of clones, to keep them all in sync and to replicate data to them consistently. So these are all very exciting technologies that all complement each other to give you a complete end-to-end set of services for clustering all the different types of workload on your Windows servers. But now let's talk about just that back-end cluster service and what's going to happen to cluster service in the Whistler time frame. Well, the most important feature is that the maximum size of a cluster will go from 2 servers, that is a pack of 2 servers, to 4 servers, a pack with 4 servers. Now this is actually an announced feature of Windows 2000 Data Center Server, which is going to be shipping sometime this summer. In Data Center Server, this feature will first be available to you, our customers, but the Data Center Server product itself has perhaps some limited availability in that it is delivered only pre-installed in complete OEM shipments, and so you bring in a whole new cluster. It's designed for very large servers, and so it's only being delivered on servers that are capable of 8 processors or larger. And so that's excellent that you can have that technology this year for those very large high-end servers for your, say, server consolidation applications. The good news about Whistler, as it notes at the bottom of this slide here, is that we're going to make this feature more broadly available. Current plan is to put 4-node clustering into the advanced server build of Whistler, which means that you'll have it on a broader range of hardware, not just the 8-processor machines for, say, server consolidation, but also perhaps smaller machines that you're using for single purpose. Also, the advanced server product is available through all of our channels, not necessarily OEM only as data center, and so it'll be easier to deploy perhaps. And so because of that, we want you to look at 4-node clustering as a technology that should be on your clustering radar for the Whistler timeframe. Now, when you're thinking about why should you deploy a 4-node cluster versus a 2-node cluster, there's some real key benefits to look at. First of all, when you have 2 servers designed to back each other up dynamically, that is, you've got that unique database, that Exchange server, those print queues. If one of the servers goes offline, for example, you take it offline for planned maintenance, say you want to install a service pack, then you use the clustering technology, the pack technology, to move the workload from that server to the one that's still up, which means you must have excess capacity on that server to handle the additional workload. With a 2-node cluster, if you want to be able to absorb a complete server offline episode with no loss of performance, that means you've got to have essentially an idle server in that 2-server cluster. With a 4-server cluster, you can now have 3 fully loaded, fully active servers and 1 idle, and still absorb fully a single server downtime event with no loss of performance. And so the cost of excess capacity in your cluster goes down as the number of nodes in the cluster goes up. Very nice cost-saving issue to look at. Another key benefit that you pick up with larger clusters is operational flexibility. And this primarily applies if you're running mixed workloads, that is, multiple independent applications on each server. With a 2-node cluster, you take one server offline, and all of the workload from that server has to go to the other. But with a 4-node cluster, if you've got, for example, independent file shares on one of these servers, or more than one SQL database, or an Exchange and SQL together, and you want to take that server offline, you can move each one of those applications to a different server in the other 3 that are still online. And so this gives you some flexibility to move workload around, to balance workloads, and to rebalance workloads in the case that you're doing maintenance and moving servers on and offline. So you'll find that these issues of lowering the cost of excess capacity and increased operational flexibility will make 4-node clusters very attractive in your deployments of data centers or other installations where you have more than 2 servers together running Windows 2000 workload. There are some changes we're also making in the Whistler timeframe for certification of 4-node clusters. Now, as I hope you're aware if you're deploying clusters today, every cluster configuration you deploy today must be fully certified together as a configuration. When you go to the hardware compatibility list, www.microsoft.com/HCL, hardware compatibility list, you query for cluster configurations by category cluster. And each entry in that list is a complete configuration. It'll say what 2 servers and what storage solution together was tested and together certified as a cluster. Well, that assures you that if you're betting your business on this high availability cluster, that it has passed some very rigorous tests performed by the vendor that provides you that cluster. But as currently set up, each unique combination of servers is a separate certification. And if you think about it, if I start having 3, 4 servers in a cluster, the combinations of different server models grows very rapidly, grows geometrically. And so we're making some changes in the certification process to make it easier for the vendors you depend upon to certify groups of servers or families of servers where you're allowed to mix freely any server in this group into a 3 or 4 node cluster which gives you a lot of flexibility determining how to grow the sizes of your clusters over time. So you'll see this start to show up on the hardware compatibility list in the Windows 2000 data center time frame. And of course, it will also apply to the 4-node clusters that are released for advanced server in the Whistler time frame. I've got some questions queued up here. Let's see if any of them are related to multi-node. And the first one is not a question. And the next one is, will Whistler cluster services utilize Kerberos, or will they stay with NTLM authentication? Well, now, actually, cluster service in Windows 2000, our currently shipping cluster service in Windows 2000 Advanced Server, you can use Kerberos for applications, for authenticating clients to applications, for doing mutual authentication, that is to authenticate the client to the server and the server to the client, and also for pass-through authentication, so that the credentials go to a connection to a server in the cluster and from that on to another aspect or another portion of the distributed application. So you can do all of that today. However, there are things you've got to do correctly when you set up your application. And so to help you do that, we're right now having Final Edit a white paper that explains how to set up an application for clusters to use Kerberos for mutual authentication and pass-through authentication. So back to our slides. I have a picture of a 2-node cluster. Okay, you've all seen this before, nothing new. Now, when I go to the picture of the 4-node cluster, there's only one difference I wanted to point out, and that is the connection between the servers and the disk is only fiber channel in 4-node. With 2-node, we'll support standard copper SCSI connections, but with 4-node, we're only going to support fiber channel connections. Quite frankly, we find that the cost is very appropriate for this size cluster. You've got broad availability of this technology now from multiple providers. The performance benefits are outstanding with fiber channel, but the most important reason that we're going to require it is that it's a lot harder to screw up fiber channel than it is SCSI. We find that our customers uniformly have a lot better experience with fiber channel-based cluster configurations than standard SCSI configurations. The cabling is simpler, and because of that, this is a configuration we want you to be able to depend upon and to make sure that you've got a very high level of availability. And so working with our industry partners, we've all decided that we're going to go ahead and require fiber channel for these larger configurations where wiring up SCSI, quite frankly, would be extremely difficult and very easy to screw up. Okay, the next set of enhancements planned for Whistler, I'm going to turn over to another program manager, Bogdan Raciborski, who specializes in our developer support issues. Bogdan?
Hi. And in an effort to make clusters easier to use and to make the development of cluster-aware applications much easier, we will introduce a resource scripting host in Whistler. When you install the Whistler build, you will see a new resource type called generic script, and it will allow you to create the resource instances that are instrumented using simple scripts that can be created, for example, in VBScript. The difference between a resource type generic script and existing resource types is that you don't have to implement this resource type using DLL and writing this in C++. You will see exactly the same entry points in the script as in the resource DLL, so you will have to implement routines to open the resource, bring it online, take it offline, and to monitor its health using entry points is alive and looks alive. But instead of writing thousands of lines of code in C++, you'll be able to do this simply in VBScript. Another feature is a new ioctl that you can use to detect cluster volumes. This is very important for applications that depend on disk resources. Well, for example, databases. When you install a database application on a cluster, database setup may need to define a dependency on the disk and would like to eliminate all disks that are not controlled by the cluster service. So this ioctl will simplify the detection of cluster volumes. And finally, we'll provide a WMI provider for cluster events that will allow you to register for WMI events and get notification when something changes in the cluster, the state of the cluster objects change, or for example, when new resources are added, new nodes are added to the cluster or are removed, or when properties of the resources change. And we have an example of the cluster event WMI schema. I don't know if you can read it, but if you need information on the schema and if you would like to test it or implement applications using this provider, you should contact cluster program managers.
Okay, thanks, Bogdan. Certainly, if you are a developer and want early access to look at our WMI schema for events, just drop me an email. My email ID is markwood, all one word with a K, and I'll get that back out to you. There's a licensing process to go through, but I'll work with you on that. 3 other quick items to note for Whistler. First of all, mount points. This was a feature of Windows 2000 that allows you to conserve drive letters. Certainly with clusters that have got a large amount of storage space, it would be a valuable enhancement to use. And we didn't support it in Windows 2000. Sorry about that. Couldn't get it tested in time. We are getting it into Whistler for you. And that's so you can support a mount point from a cluster disk to a cluster disk. Next, we'll be able to speed up the failover of IP addresses and network names. There's a nice feature that went into Windows 2000 we're going to take advantage of to reduce the time. And it's be about 3 or 4 seconds per network name speed up on failover. And finally, of course, rolling upgrades. That you will be able to do rolling upgrades from a Windows 2000 Advanced Server Cluster to a Whistler Advanced Server Cluster, so that you can go ahead and start deploying today and know that your applications can stay up with very, very minimal downtime, so we can move them between servers in that pack as you go to Whistler next year. So what's going to happen after Whistler? Basically, we'll keep looking at your requirements for how large a cluster you need. Market research shows that regardless of the clustering technology, virtually all pack clusters deployed today have 4 or fewer nodes. So we think we're right on line with delivering what you need today, but we'll keep track of that and increase the size as needed. Installation, configuration, we'll continue to make sure this gets easier and easier so that you can deploy clusters, for example, in your remote sales offices, warehouses, distribution sites. We'll make sure that the management services are easier, in particular for lights out, scripted, headless management, the ones that our enterprise customers require. We'll make sure that these services work with all of the Windows operating system services. We'll continue to expand that over time, even as new services are introduced into the operating system. We'll make sure that the various technologies that I talked about earlier about clustering work well together, and that, of course, will extend the same level of support to all the ISVs you depend upon. So you can pause these slides later on. We're about out of time though for this presentation, and this has URLs for more information on Windows clustering. And if you want to find us and send information to the clustering team as a whole, you can drop an email to msclusfb, Microsoft Cluster Feedback, @microsoft.com. There's a couple other questions. Looks like I need to answer these one offline, so we'll get back to you if you have other questions. I thank you very much for your time, and for Bogdan and myself, we look forward to working with you on Whistler next year.